Mr. Dionne began his career as a political pundit with the New York Times and has been with the Washington Post for more than 25 years, and I'm sure we all read about him in the Inquirer as well, read his column. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a professor at Georgetown and a best-selling author. And in that way, he mirrors his partner, Dionne Ornstein, who's also a best-selling author in the New York Times. So Dionne Ornstein has been involved in political reform for decades. I'm sure many of you have read his stuff over the decades. He was particularly interested in campaign finance reform and reform of the Senate committees. He was co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and senior counselor to the continuity of the government commission. I hadn't known about that, so I'm stumbling over it, but it just shows that there's a great depth in this. He's also played a part in the Congressional Office of Compliance and the House Office of Congressional Ethics. When did we need it more? Today, Dr. Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic, and a BBC News election analyst. So their new book, do you all know the title? With intentional reference to the Declaration of Independence, written with their co-author, Thomas Mann, actually may give us, as the Kirkus Review says, a breath of hope, and also take, as they say, a serious call to action that everyone needs to take part. Did you see the New York Times review right after the book came out recently? It said, if someone had hibernated through the 2016 election, woke up early this year and logged onto Twitter or turned onto cable news and wondered what the hell happened, this would be the book to read. Their conversation is with Dick Polman, who's a writer in residence at the University of Pennsylvania and national political columnist at WHYY's wonderful newsworks.org. We are so honored to have them as part of our new Center for Public Life at the Free Library of Philadelphia. Please join me in welcoming E.J. Dionne, Dionne Ornstein, and Dick Polman.
I don't think there's anything worth to talk about, so I don't know, we can all leave now. We are, thanks again for the Free Library for hosting this Norman, EJ, and myself. And what I'd like to do is make a quick observation, which is I think that maybe many of us can agree with, which is that over the last 8 or 9 months, we've kind of felt like that figure in the Edward Munch painting, The Screamer. I think probably 3 times an hour if you look at Twitter. What I wanted to start about the book, which is, believe it or not, and we were talking about this upstairs, this is an optimistic book. There is hope. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But I wanted to basically start by asking these guys, what's so interesting is that the inauguration was January 20th. And we're sitting here on October 10th. It's only been less than 10
years?
Less than less than 9 months in person time. And yet you started writing this book, One Nation After Trump, in February. So the administration was barely a month old and you were already starting to think beyond Trump. And I'm just curious, why did you feel the impulse or the impetus, I should say, to start so quickly and so early? Did you basically see the contours of where we were going and how people were going to be feeling?
Well, let me say first, Dick, we are now just about 270 days into the Trump presidency, or as he says, longer than any other president.
Like nothing we've seen before.
That's right. No president has served this long in history. I think like so many of us, first of all, E.J. wrote an incredible book, Why the Right Went Wrong. Tom Mann and I had written a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, followed by an updated edition, It's Even Worse Than It Was. We had seen the changes in our politics, including the changes in the Republican Party and the changes in the society, the rise of tribalism, coming for a long time, long before Trump. So we were alarmed. As we saw Trump emerge, and the political science and much of the community thought, this is just going to go the way it usually does. The Republican Party will flirt with an outsider, and then they'll nominate the insider, as they always do. It was going to be Jeb Bush. We'd had 41 and 43, and We were going to have 45, as they say in the family, no child left behind. And he didn't make it. Well, we knew there would be an outsider emerging because of the way things were going, the populism emerging, the darker forces. So we were ready, once he won, to think through what could we do about this as people who've written about this before. And I think the idea of a book of this sort just sort of flowed, and the three of us had been dear friends for a long time, had been on the same wavelength with so many of these issues, so it was a natural partnership.
Could I say, just before I sort of have a couple of words on that, I just want to say what a joy it is to be at the Philadelphia Public Library. This is one of the greatest venues in the country for books, and you're one of the greatest audiences, so thank you. My late mom was a teacher in a library, and I always say that I disagree with George W. Bush on many things, but I absolutely approved of his taste in whom he chose to marry. Because, as you know, Laura was a teacher and a librarian. I also want to shout out a couple of people. Our editor, Tim Bartlett, where are you, Tim, is in the audience, and this book wouldn't have happened without him. But even more important, his mom, Barbara, is in the audience. So I think we should have a hand for Barbara. And his in-laws, and I also want to thank a very dear friend of mine who's here somewhere, Elizabeth Tom, who was my assistant for several years and is a brilliant person. She left me to go get a graduate degree at Oxford, and she's here with her parents, who are deeply involved in Philadelphia civic life. So bless you for being here, Elizabeth. Oh yeah, let's give Liz Tom a hand. Just one other point on that. When Trump got elected, there were a lot of people who said, well, he'll grow in office, and that he can't possibly be as much of a threat as everyone says. And the three of us just didn't believe that. And had he grown in office, we either would have written a different book, or our editor would have called us and said, about that book, maybe you shouldn't write that book after all. But we sort of had a sense, all three of us, that that he was not going to change, that the evidence of his life, of the campaign, his lack of curiosity about government, his attitude toward government itself, there were so many things about him that we have come to see that we thought were obvious from the very first day he announced his candidacy and spoke of Mexican immigrants as rapists. We felt this is not a man who is going to change in office. And so we set out to write this book, but we also felt that there was a need to lay out an alternative path forward, because we believe that implicit in the movement against Trump is an affirmation of a whole series of things. People are against Trump because they believe in democracy. They are against Trump because they believe in a free press. They're against Trump because they believe that presidents should be expected to act in certain ways and not act in other ways. They're against Trump because they basically respect the obligations of self-government. And so we wanted to lay out what would the alternative look like, because we do need an alternative to Trumpism in the country. And so the whole second half of the book is our vision of how we can begin to move forward out of this.
Yeah, not going to change. Character is destiny, as the old saying is going. You get to be that age, you're not going to all of a sudden, become, a different individual. I don't care the office, the person fills the office, or the person is shaped by the office. I think the person brings who they are to the office. And but I think one of the interesting things early on in the book, you sort of sound the alarm where you say that our democracy is, this is a quote, under challenge as it has not been since the 1930s. And I think that kind of like sets up for the reader, here's why you should be paying attention. But, I think what you said about the second half of the book, that, it's basically, I think, what we need to do and how we need to try to do it. I want to read a quote from early on, which I think gives us the gist to some extent. You said early on, that defeating Trump will require both a vigorous defense of rights of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and the families of immigrants who feel threatened by Trump's hostility, plus an understanding of the legitimate grievances of white working class voters who expressed their frustrations by supporting him. And I want to talk about some of that stuff in a second, but what I wanted to just focus on actually was those first two words, defeating Trump. And I'm just curious if you can clarify, what do you mean by, how do you define defeating him? Is it isolating him politically? Is it electing a Democratic Congress in the midterms of 2018 and instituting impeachment hearings? Is it trying to find leaders in the Democratic Party who can start early to work toward 2020 and defeating him there? What do you mean by defeating Trump?
I think it's a whole lot of things, but it's not just defeating the person. It's defeating the ideas behind it. It's defeating a style of governance. It's defeating the ignorance of norms and of normal practices. And it will require taking on Trump directly. It will require taking on the people who enable Trump. It will require elections that can make a difference. And speaking of it not in a partisan way, and this is something that all of us have been troubled by for a long time. It includes, we'll get to the press a little bit more, the false equivalence that we've seen in the past. People behave badly, they have to be held to account. And if Alabama elects a Roy Moore, that sends a signal. That's not a very good signal. Whether Donald Trump leaves because he's shot by one of his ex-wives, or maybe she's aiming at the other wife and misses, who knows, or leaves because he's indicted by Mueller, or leaves because he quits, or leaves after he's defeated in the next election, however that goes, that's only one stage in this. And a lot of our book is talking about repairing the country, and that's what that paragraph is about, what that couple of sentences is about, more than it is about Trump per se.
Mm-hmm. Let me just ask a question about the Republicans first, and I do definitely want to get to the Democrats because I think they're an important piece of this whole thing. What is it going to take for Republicans, leaders, and Bob Corker aside, the senator from Tennessee, little Bob, as Trump is tweeting about him now today. What is it going to take for Republicans to actually stand up in public and say, this guy is unhinged. We all know he's unhinged. We all talk amongst ourselves that he's unfit for office. He's scaring the hell out of us on the global, on the world stage. What is it going to take? Just the fact that are they waiting for like a 22% support for Trump at their base back home, and is that their only metric?
Well, I think there's the miraculous solution and the realistic solution. Our Lady of Perpetual Help will appear in front of the Capitol and tell the Republicans they have to behave differently. That's the realistic solution. The miraculous, the miraculous solution is they'll come to their senses, find courage, and oppose Donald Trump. I think that the Corker moment is revealing. On the one hand, it does suggest that at least some Republicans, and by the way, even more in the conservative writing world, I think what's fascinating is how many conservative writers, intellectuals and the like have joined the anti-Trump camp, but a lot of Republican politicians, with a few exceptions, haven't. So now you add Corker to a list that includes, a short list that includes John McCain, Charlie Dent, who's not running from here, who's not running for re-election, sometimes Lindsey Graham, mostly Susan Collins, most of the time. But it's a really quite short list of elected officials and nobody in the leadership. And I think they're afraid of primaries. They're afraid of Trump's Republican approval ratings. They had been hoping that Trump would be, at least he was good for a set of fingers holding a pen who would sign the repeal of Obamacare. That didn't happen. Now they're still hoping for the tax cuts. What they are getting out of Trump are a whole lot of judges, including Neil Gorsuch, who's arguably one of the maybe the most conservative member of the court right now, or most right-wing member of the court. And they're getting an extraordinary amount of action on executive orders. I mean, time after time, whether it's on climate, on workers' rights, on regulation of finance, the world of finance. I mean, they are getting a lot of things they want there. And I sort of sometimes despair that this leadership will ever move off Trump unless Mueller finds things that force their hand, or the politics begin to change. And there are at least a few polls showing that Trump is actually losing ground, not only among independents, but among Republicans. And I think that the trick will be, are they more afraid of losing primaries, or are they more afraid of losing the whole thing? And at some point, maybe they will turn. And we should remember, it took Republicans a long time to turn on Nixon. We have a kind of heroic story of Watergate because of the way it turned out. And as things roll forward, more and more Republicans were willing to start questioning Nixon, but it was still a minority who voted to impeach him on the Judiciary Committee. So Corker has not let loose, a flood of courage all of a sudden. He's still kind of standing there all alone. I mean, I'm at least waiting for the other little Marco to defend Bob. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah, which one is shorter? That's what I want to know. Which little Marco or little...
Let me add a
no heightism here, please.
A couple of comments on that as well. One is a short-term danger. I think it's precisely because Trump has started to see support from some of his core begin to decline that he's taken some of the more reckless steps that he has in the last few days, trying desperately to shore that up. And that includes the statement on immigration, which is doubling down on all the hardline stuff and threatening to blow up the potential deal with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on the Dreamers. It includes what now is a very overt attempt to sabotage Obamacare with a set of executive orders. It includes the obsession with the NFL and the players and the flag. And if that support continues to decline, I fear that instead of trying to reach out more broadly, he will double down even more on some of these things. The second comment is, I was struck by something said by Mark Meadows, who's the chairman of the Freedom Caucus in the House. And it tells you an awful lot about the Republicans in Congress. I came in 1969 to the House. One of the people who served as a congressional fellow with me was a very conservative fellow in the Defense Department, and he left and he created the House Republican Study Committee, which was supposed to be the right-wing caucus of the House, pulling the party to the right. Had about 10% of the members of the caucus. Now it's got 85%. And the Freedom Caucus, which has about 50 members, formed because the right-wing caucus wasn't right-wing enough. And that's Mark Meadows. But Mark Meadows said after Corker, well, that's easy to say when you're not going to be running anymore. And it tells you something, that what all of these people, as EJ said, are saying privately, this guy's nuts. We can't deal with him. How are we going to contain him? And you know that if they could, the vast majority, if they could snap their fingers or click their heels 3 times and have him disappear and make Mike Pence president, and they could get their tax cuts and maybe get more things done, they'd love to do it. But they're scared to death, not just of the base turning on them, which is a good portion of their base, but as EJ alluded to, and it's an important part of this, we can't ignore the big money in politics, the Mercers and others who will come against them, and the tribal media army that's behind Trump, from Hannity to Limbaugh to Ingram, who will defend him. That what they should be saying, not just to save the country, but also to save their own party from becoming a fringe element, they're not willing to do. And Corker is very well liked by his Republican colleagues. The idea that not one of them has stood up and said, Bob Corker is right and I'm with him. But they're all, a few of them are saying, well, he's a good guy, but we don't want to get into that. Or when they're asked, ask Corker about it. Tells you volumes about where the level of courage is in this system now.
Well, is there one more Corker question? Is there, what if he were to, he's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. It's a very powerful committee, it can be a very influential committee. why doesn't he, take this opportunity, since he's got nothing to lose, he's not running again, to hold hearings, essentially, an educational series of hearings on the dysfunctional Trump foreign policy apparatus, and bring people to the Hill. And I forget who said this. I mentioned this in a column this morning. Oh, that's my product placement for the night. And I mentioned James Fallows also wrote about this, I think, in the Atlantic. Like J. William Fulbright, 50 years ago, when he was Senate Foreign Relations Chairman, had a series of hearings on Vietnam and brought it to the public's attention about, how this disaster was unfolding, and it helped to shape public opinion going down the road. He has it within his power to do something analogous to that. Do you think there's any chance he might do that, or is this just going to be, he'll just talk when he's prompted and that's it?
This is why this man has always been one of my favorite political columnists. I mean, that's truly, no, it's a great idea, and I think his party would raise holy hell at the moment if he tried to do that. And, he is a chairman. I suppose he could do it if he wanted to, but I think the party would try to block that. They're still not ready for that. But I'd love to see those hearings, and I'd love to see General Mattis under oath on these things. And, I'm serious, because of all the people in there, I think Mattis has been the one who has been kind of most resistant to the worst of what's going on, as best I can tell. And I'd love to sort of hear his private conversations every night and see if he'd share any of that at a hearing.
Well, Norm, you mentioned before, you mentioned Hannity and the whole conservative machine that would, support Trump if, in these situations against Republicans who stand up against him. Where does Steve Bannon fit into all this? I mean, I just saw him on Fox News today talking about how he was going to take down the entire Republican establishment, kind of like, the pitchfork brigade kind of approach. I can't quite tell in my mind if he is, because he stood against Trump in the Alabama race.
Yeah.
He was for more, Trump was not. Is he on Trump's side, or is he there to basically goad Trump back toward Bannonism, if there is such a thing?
I think Bannon saw Trump as his useful tool to accomplish his goals. And what he's now doing, and I'm not sure that Trump is entirely averse to this, although obviously it was an enormous embarrassment to him to support Luther Strange, which is...
Big Luther as opposed to little Bob, by the way.
but it's
he
like
likes them tall, right?
if you were looking for a supervillain in a Superman movie, his name would be Luther Strange. But Trump supporting him and Bannon going all out for Roy Moore was an embarrassment to him. But Trump is perfectly happy to have an agitator outside who goes after Republican establishment figures. Having said that, what Bannon is now doing is going to almost every Republican incumbent state who's up for re-election and trying to recruit somebody to their right to run against them in a primary, which is a self-destructive task if you are trying to help a president actually get any kind of a program enacted, but no more self-destructive than with a 52-48 majority in the Senate, having a president go after a guy who has voted with him on just about everything, which he's done with Bob Corker. And for me, the test of Corker, I'd love to have those hearings. The real test is he now going to vote against horrific legislation just because it's proposed by Mitch McConnell and where there's a push to get everybody to hang together, when it is done without, as McCain has said, any semblance of the regular order, when it is destructive and foolish legislation? Is he now going to be free to do those kinds of things? And if he does, and that includes a tax bill that on its surface would increase debt by $1.5 to $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years, and he said he won't vote for anything that increases the deficit by a dime. He didn't say he wouldn't vote for anything that increases the deficit by $1 trillion.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Wiggle room.
Yeah, but if he does that, and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and McCain and a couple of others join with him,
It's dead.
and then they could actually force a different kind of policy dynamic that would not be nearly as destructive, and that would be true on the healthcare front as well. So that, to me, is the test of Bob Corker, and it's been the test of Ben Sass and Jeff Flake and some of the others who have courageously said the truth about where their party is and where Trump is, and then they vote for everything.
Could I just say on Bannon, I think Bannon sees Trump the way many of us see Trump, which is that Trump doesn't really believe much of anything. And that primary in Alabama was about sending a signal to Trump that your people will not follow you just anywhere, that actually your people believe this stuff that Bannon believes, that the alt-right believes, and that he wanted to show Trump. So I saw that as the Bannon-Trump primary, and Bannon won. And it's interesting to see what Trump, and that in a sense, if you, just to go back to what Norm said, it kind of looks like Trump got that message, because he's made a number of moves toward the far right, sending, at least on the symbolic level, saying, I'm with you. And probably the most important was laying out this list of demands on immigration that are just completely unacceptable to Democrats. He sent a signal early that he was willing to compromise with Pelosi and Schumer, with his new dear friends Chuck and Nancy. And now this is really pulling back from that. And so it's as if the Bannon signal has reached Trump in some way.
Well, you know what, if he starts tweeting about Schumer as crying Chuck again, then we know that we're back to square one. But it's, it's just very weird, this whole thing about, it's like trying to fly a plane with one wing, it's like, the right wing only, and this is,
the best line on this was Ronald Reagan, who once said that the problem with my administration is that the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing.
He's a witty guy. All right, so we have a divided Republican Party. Maybe that's grounds for optimism or something. So let's talk about the Democrats for a second, because I don't know what the, Trump sucks up so much oxygen that the Democrats don't even get written about is probably as, and I'm probably as much to blame on that as anybody. It's like there's so much stuff every day that's like I say, all right, I really should focus on the Democrats today, but then 10 other things happen. But here's the thing: so you've got this thing where you like the idea of having a fusion, that the Democrats would become, as you call it, a fusion party. Right, where they're basically, they're trying to build a coalition, they're trying to get back the white working class voters that they used to have, while holding on to, say, the Obama electorate, right? Fusion. The idea of adding, what is this? You invoked Mark Shields, the columnist Mark Shields, who talked about courting converts, not hunting heretics. So the idea of expanding the Democratic Party. I really want to know: have you seen any evidence in the last X number of months that Democrats are up to this challenge? And I really mean that with total skepticism, because I haven't seen it.
Actually, I think the best single, just one thing on the fusion idea. The fusion is a really old idea that goes back to the progressive era in the 30s. And it was what happened in a lot of big cities where reformers would run, often they were liberal Republicans like LaGuardia running against corrupt Democratic machines, and they were actually trying to build an alliance that included a lot of liberal Democrats who were against corruption, and so they declared themselves not Republican candidates or party candidates, but fusion candidates, trying to pull together all the forces in a community that wanted reform. And so in the fusion idea, it's very specifically that people who are opposed to Trump and who believe that he and his program have to be stopped should welcome support from everywhere they can get it, where people fundamentally agree on the need to stop certain abuses by Trump. And we talk about that including the anti-Trump conservatives, whom we might disagree with. I personally would disagree with on a number of issues, but I admire the witness, their witness against the abuses that Trump represents. On the Democratic Party, the best example of their hanging together is the saving of Obamacare. That this was a huge deal, and every single Democrat, from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin, held together and said, we will not deal with the Republicans if their purpose is to repeal Obamacare. We will be happy to negotiate to make Obamacare get better, be happy to negotiate to fix some of the problems. And the interesting question will be, will they do the same on the tax bill? I think it may be a little harder to maintain that, although the tax bill looks to me so abusive that they might even be able to hold that. So that's one sign, I think, that the Democrats are capable of standing up and actually being united. I also think you're seeing a kind of pulling back from some of these primaries that people were talking about, where having the whole period up to 2018 being a kind of brawl within the party to settle long-term, to settle ideological fights. I think you're seeing much more of a sentiment among Democrats from the center to the left saying, no, our first priority has to be to stop Trump. And we're going to have these arguments, and they should have these arguments, but we're not going to sort of ruin the possibility of taking over the House or the Senate. The Senate's going to be really hard. Neither is easy. It's already difficult enough. And so I think you're seeing a pulling back from fratricidal politics, which in the case of the Democratic Party, that might be the miraculous solution because Democrats are very good at fratricidal politics.
Right,
but
so,
anyway, so I think, the book was, it's even worse than it looks, I once wrote a book called They Only Look Dead. I think in this case, they're not as bad as everyone is saying, and the divisions aren't as deep as everyone is saying. I'm curious.
Well, so that's a perfect segue. The question then, to keep on this, is, Norm, what I got out of the book, a lot of the interesting parts in the first part of the book, which was, really trying to dig into exactly, why Trump emerged, where the Democrats fell short, looking back before we look ahead in the second half. And in that first half, one of the things I think that was struck by, and it makes total sense to me, is the feeling among a lot of voters, and there were all these, especially these Obama to Trump voters, that they had so much economic anxiety, they felt they were being left behind economically in their communities, either because of trade deals and the jobs going away, they were working harder for less money, and that Trump was able to harvest a lot of that. And it would seem to me, and you mentioned this in the book, that one key, it seems, for 2018 midterms and beyond, but 2018 midterms, is that the Democrats, if you're going to nationalize the congressional elections, which they all seem to be happening more and more, that you're going to need some kind of an inclusive economic message that addresses these voters who switched to Trump, and maybe they're disaffected now, and you can maybe take advantage of that, but you have to sort of reach them with an economic message that, for whatever reason, it's complicated, Hillary couldn't get through with. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So let me address it in a couple of ways. First, everybody should keep in mind that in barely more than 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we're going to have some pivotal elections that have been almost completely off the radar screen unless you're in and around these states. And that's New Jersey and in particular Virginia. And if the Democratic candidate for governor in Virginia, Ralph Northam, beats Ed Gillespie decisively, and Democrats pick up a significant number of legislative seats, it's going to have a real effect on the Democratic Party and on the Republican Party. You're going to see Republicans at that point begin to get a little more distance from Trump, because what the polls have shown is that a lot of voters are motivated by their antipathy towards Trump right now. If the election's very close, you'll have a different effect. What's happened on the Democratic side is there's been an enormous wave of candidates emerging, people we never thought would run before. In districts where they couldn't find anybody to run, you got people lining up to run. And one of the things that makes us optimistic, young people are starting to talk more about running for local office, about getting into and engaging themselves in the political world and the policy world. And that is an extraordinarily hopeful sign. Instead of saying, who needs any of this crap, maybe you go to an NGO or a nonprofit, but they're engaging in what's really important here. So that's important. Now, having said that, one caveat is when you're in the minority and you don't have chairmanships and you don't have levers of power, you can look headless or leaderless, and it certainly is the case that the leaders that the Democratic Party has are people who've been around for a very long time, and they get criticized often for that. And it'll be interesting to see if there is a primary challenge. The one that's emerging is not an ideological one, it is a chronological one. And that is the challenge to Dianne Feinstein, who announced yesterday at 84 that she was going to run for another term. And I think it is extremely likely that a younger Democrat, maybe one a little bit to her left, but it'll be slight gradations, will run against her, and that won't jeopardize the seat. And it won't be like many of the Republican primaries where you're pulling somebody over to a crazy side. It's not going to be somebody way off on the left. But we're not seeing those other challenges, which is what distinguishes Democrats at this point from Republicans. Now, having said that, there are always dynamics where the ideological wing tries to pull the party away from the center, and the pragmatic wing tries to keep that from happening. And I don't think it's going to be a terrible problem in 2018. We have no idea what will happen in 2020. For Democrats, it's going to be like the Republicans this last time. There'll probably be 17 candidates out there.
The size of the Philadelphia phone book is the Democratic field.
And who knows who emerges on a stage where maybe they limit it to 11 the way they did the last time. But right now, despite all the noise about Sanders pushing a single-payer system, if you notice, he's got like 15 co-sponsors. But that's it. It's not like every Democrat has said, oh my God, we're scared of the left or we've got to move in that direction. Most of them are saying that's a great long-term goal. Right now we need to insure people and shore up the Affordable Care Act. So there's signs of pragmatism there. And I think you win a couple of these mid-midterm elections, off-year elections, and there'll be a little bit of a boost there. And there are a lot of younger people out there, some not in Washington. Jason Kander, the former Secretary of State in Missouri, who's a terrific figure. Pete Buttigieg, who's the mayor of South Bend. Both Afghanistan veterans. Buttigieg, a gay man, a married gay man, mayor of South Bend, which is not exactly like Berkeley. There's leadership coming forward. And I would say I worry that I'm not seeing that on the Republican side. When I look at the farm team out there, I see state legislators who have completely bought into the sort of closed information loop that's coming from the Alex Jones, Laura Ingraham world. And they're crazier than a lot of the members of Congress. And if we don't get back a Republican Party that is going to be a very conservative party, but that's a more pragmatic problem-solving one, that's a bigger danger to me right now than a Democratic Party that could move enough to the left that it would be really bad, but that at this point I don't see showing signs of having that happen.
Is it, let's talk for a second about the role of the press. We've talked about our various institutions, and neither EJ or me, for that matter, so would presume to be speaking for the press, which is not monolithic and all that. So with that caveat, I mentioned earlier that Hillary did have an economic message to some extent in 2016, and if you looked on her website, if you looked on their, on the campaign website, you saw very clearly it was all laid out in actual specifics. But I think you made a mention in the book somewhere along the way about how not much attention was paid to it, and so what I'm thinking is does the press did the press do anything last year that you think it needs to do better in terms of its own role in, revitalizing democracy? I know that's a broad question, but you could take it.
Yeah, no, the short answer is yes. I was in our kitchen at the end of 2015, and I had the TV on a cable channel, and it was a live Trump speech. And I said to myself, I don't feel like watching a live Trump speech. So I switched to another cable channel. And it was the same live Trump speech. And I turned to my wife and I said, what do we have now? Trump state television? And I think when you look back at that campaign, particularly in the early stages, the amount of unmediated, uncritical time that Trump got, sometimes, yeah, go ahead. Sometimes,
2 billion, right?
Sometimes they cut from Rubio or Hillary or Jeb Bush rally to an empty stage waiting for Trump to get on the stage. And I think that's more than anything, and this is, I mean, it's, in a way, it's easy for me to say because my primary and deep loyalty is to newspapers. You know, that, and newspapers have some of their problems, although I'll let Norm do those. But, you know, this was a real problem, and we have the number in the book where Trump got something close to $2 billion of free time, and no one came close. You know, Cruz on the Republican side, a few hundred million. Hillary got about 700 million. I mean, there was just no comparison. So I think in that early stage, especially, there was a real problem in Trump commanding the media. I don't mind networks showing live speeches. I think that's good, but they better show them. They have to show, you talk about Fox News, fair and balanced. Well, let's show a number of candidates giving live speeches. Let's not just show empty Trump platforms. So I think that's problem A. Problem B was there was eventually very tough scrutiny of Trump. And we say in the book that Trump is the first candidate in history to fend off one scandal with another scandal, you know, because they were cascading out at the end. The irony is Trump complains often that no one took his chances of winning seriously. First, I think so many mistakes got made in that campaign because people thought Trump couldn't win. But secondly, the fact is that the scrutiny happened later. Whereas with Hillary, you had just a steady focus on three sort of basic scandals. You know, the speeches, the server, and for a while it was
Foundation.
And the foundation, and for a while it was Benghazi until that sort of failed to materialize. And so oddly, she got hurt because there was a relentless focus on that stuff, and Trump gave you a kind of potpourri of scandals to cover. And, you know, there was the basic question that wasn't asked, which is, and we write this in the book, that Hillary had the flaws of other politicians, but one of these things was not like the other. And that Trump had a set of disabilities that were just not comparable to the normal flaws that Hillary Clinton had. There was just no, and that's a problem. Now, having said all that, after the election, the press is now one of the most important institutions holding Trump to account. And, you know, I'm very proud. I work for the Washington Post. And bless you. And I think that there are a lot of people in the press and in the media. There are other, not just newspapers, not just print or pixels, you know, who take very seriously their job of trying to figure out what is going on in this administration, calling lies lies. That extraordinary page that the New York Times printed in little type. You know, it took a while. There was a debate. Well, can we call them lies? And now people are calling them out. So I think, you know, so we have two views in the book. Basically, we're critical of some of the things that I've described. At the same time, we think that a free press is deeply important to a republic, and that the whole war on the idea of truth and the attempt, it's a classic road to autocracy move where you try to pretend that there are no facts. You throw up so much sand that people you know, don't trust anything anymore, and we got to fight that.
Right. You know, authoritarianism depends on people getting exhausted, the citizenry getting exhausted. So no more false equivalents.
What would happen if you stopped covering every one of his tweets? Because I think all he wants to do is create diversion, and so you, by covering everyone, you're feeding into his mythology?
It's a good question. Let me tweet about that.
Can I see if it's on yet?
This is something actually that I know many of my colleagues in the press agonize over. And unfortunately, they didn't agonize over many things during the campaign that they should have agonized over. But you're talking about the President of the United States. And everything that the President of the United States says and every way in which he communicates is an important story and it's newsworthy. And if reporters, if there were some sort of understanding in the mainstream media that we aren't going to cover this stuff, other people, including those around the world, are still going to pay attention to what he says. And you can't say that, hey, it's just off-the-cuff stuff, don't pay any attention to it. He is the President of the United States. And, the danger is he does something that is unhinged, and then Kim Jong-un can take it seriously or seriously enough that it might lead to not just a war of words, but a misunderstanding sometime down the road. But I don't know how you can avoid covering what a president says, even if it is designed for reasons that have little to do with what he's actually saying.
And I agree with that. I mean, very quickly, you can just tie yourself into complete knots. Somebody wrote a parody of a news story saying, well, we are covering today the diversion from the diversion from the diversion from the diversion. In other words, it's hard to tell what is the diversion and what isn't, or what are you being diverted from. And you can argue that, well, he wouldn't do it, but who would be in this consortium that agrees not to cover the tweets? Everyone would see them. They would be out there. And I think you have to hold them accountable for tweets just like you hold them accountable for everything else.
If you're writing about the tweets and you context it and even say, and columnists, of course, have that freedom, to say, these tweets are a diversion of a diversion, and it's a political decision to get people's attention away from these more serious things, and you put context on it, then it can be more valuable that way.
I'm working on something where I'm just comparing. Hillary Clinton had a tweet this week saying, let's pay attention to the fact that Congress has not renewed the children's health care program. Donald Trump had a tweet on Little Bob. I would argue that's why 2.9 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, but perhaps I'm wrong. But I think, if you just look at those two tweets, you actually learn quite a lot about how these two people are different.
Very early in the campaign, I think it was, the New York Times Sunday magazine did an extensive article about Roy Cohn and how he was Trump's mentor. Mm-hmm. Why didn't the press and the candidates ever do anything about that? And why are we surprised that Trump is Roy Cohn as president?
Trump had two mentors. His father, who was a sadistic racist and taught him as a man in real estate that lying is like breathing. And Roy Cohn, who taught him
Tell us what you really think, Norm,
and Roy Cohn, who taught him a lot of other very evil stuff. But I would also say, and it gets back to the press issue, early on the New York Times did some really good investigative work, including work about Trump's own sadistic behavior towards his own family, including cutting off the medical expenses for his grandnephew with cerebral palsy, in a long, well-reported piece early in the primary season. And then never repeated it, and nobody else did. And when I tell people about this, I get often from those who follow things closely, I didn't know that. So a lot of stories, when you do it once, it's like, well, it's out there, we don't need to do it again. They didn't do that with the emails. There was an obsession there. But a lot of the stuff about Trump that informed us about what kind of a person he was, who his mentors were, what he learned from them, was out there early. But because there were so many candidates, because early on so many people didn't think he'd be the nominee, we had the same phenomenon that later on was, well, he's not going to win. So that's a real problem that I hope gets some self-reflection in the press.
Over on this side?
Just a lot of people in the country didn't know who Roy Cohn was anymore. And that I think that you were going to see some stories. I just don't think it would have had the effect, even though you're quite right that it's very instructive. I'm not sure it would have had an enormous effect, even if it had gotten more coverage.
But the Republicans are so good at repetition. You know, if there had been a Roy Cohn type person on some candidate on the Democratic side, they would have found a way to repeat it 1 trillion times, and it would have gotten into people's heads, don't you think?
Abortion rights are still very divisive in this country, but birth control and hormone therapy are very much not so. I think it's something like 70% of women are in support of birth control and hormone therapy. And as a woman who has suffered from infertility, hormone therapy is very important to my family planning. In that vein, has the White House made a mistake in this particular overreach to go after something that has such a large support among women across Republican and Democratic bases?
You know, what I found so interesting is that during the campaign and even in the year before, you had all these protestations from many Republicans. Oh, we're not going after birth control. This is all about abortion. And now they don't even say it anymore. It's clearly an appeal to that core part of the Trump base that is the evangelical Christian base. And I think it's a deeper set of issues. To me, for a long time, what this has been about is people whose fundamental belief is not about the sanctity of life so much as it is, if you have sex, you should be punished. And that includes some of the bizarre things happening in the country, I would say, like this horrible case in Michigan of a woman who was raped at 12, gave birth, and now the court has given joint custody to the rapist. And it's mostly because they want to claw back some of the welfare money that she's been getting. It's a horrible world we live in. Now we have clearly a challenge to fundamental birth control that's going to lead to a lot more abortions. And what we're getting a lot of is, it costs almost nothing to have birth control. You know, and every woman in the room knows that it costs plenty if you're going to get.
It can be a month's salary.
It can be an enormous sum of money, and having health insurance that pays for that protects health and lives and reduces the number of abortions. So this, like so many other areas where we're blowing up environmental regulations, we're changing the way we do business, we're cutting government programs that most people haven't thought about that affect their lives, is going to be a real question of whether it's a wake-up call for people that gets them mobilized. And I don't have the answer to that yet.
Just two quick things. One is, I think there are people in the pro-life movement who are very serious, but the test then is, what do you do for mothers after the kids are born? What do you do for the kids? If you're going to be pro-life, you need to be pro-life all the way through. The second point is long-term, I think your intuition is correct, that the abortion, people can argue about contraception, is a closed question for about 90 to 95% of Americans, no matter what their religious views are. And Obama certainly used it quite effectively in the 2012 campaign as an issue. So if you're asking a political question, I think there's a real cost over the long run if you go after if you go after contraception.
Pennsylvania has been described as Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Alabama in the middle. You're preaching to the choir with this audience. How are you going to get the ideas you're expressing tonight across to the Alabamans in Pennsylvania?
Thank you.
That's the challenge, isn't it? That's it.
We talk a lot in this book about that. I had my favorite personal experience during the campaign in 2016. It's my friend David Brooks and I were giving a talk. We were sort of on a panel together, and I mentioned in the course of it that if I made a hat, the hat would say "Make America Empathetic Again." And we talked a lot about empathy when we were writing the book, and we have a lot in there about this. And the kind of spirit and the kind of leadership we need in the country is a spirit that says, people who are white should be asked how can they not empathize with an African American parent who is worried that their child, your teenage son will go out at night and might get shot even though he's unarmed, shot by the police. And we ought to feel empathy for that. But we also ought to feel empathy for a guy, a white guy, in Erie or Reading or a lot of other places, or Scranton or Wilkes-Barre, who had a decent factory job. The factory goes abroad or goes out of business, and suddenly sees his and his family's living standards cut in half. And I say a guy on purpose, not to be sexist, but I think that this particular dislocation, women have suffered in a whole bunch of other ways, but this particular dislocation, I think, has been felt very acutely by working class men in towns like the ones I've mentioned. And it ought to be possible for us to think simultaneously of those two people and say, how can one not have fellow feeling for them? And also, might they have fellow feeling toward each other? And I think this whole idea that you can sort of put aside, I quote, identity politics entirely and forget about the particular problems of African Americans or Latinos, I think that's a mistake. But it's also a mistake to say that you can continue to ignore or downplay the problems of white working class people. In fact, deindustrialization has hurt the inner city, and it's also hurt many of these predominantly white towns around the country. And I was really struck recently when you think about the 1963 Civil Rights March. The slogan of that march was jobs and freedom. And the whole argument of that poster is that if you care about economic justice, you have to care about racial justice. And if you care about racial justice, you have to care about economic justice. And we got to figure out how to talk about those things together.
Let me just say very quickly that
thank you.
In this book, which, by the way, makes a great holiday gift.
Well timed.
And as Norm likes to say, there is always another holiday in a week or two.
Every week. The last third looks at solutions, some of them policy. And many of the policies that we have there, including a GI Bill for American workers and for families, are designed to appeal to working and middle-class people, and that includes white and non-white working and middle-class people. A lot of policies can be out there that can give people a sense of hope, that you're understanding what their problems are, and maybe create a different atmosphere. And we have to avoid what happened during Reconstruction, when you had white and black sharecroppers, working class people who had so much in common, and the elites used race to divide them. And we have to work overtime to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that doesn't happen if we can appeal to the broader interest and commonality that we share.
And one of the lines we use in the book is we should not hold one group's pain against another group's pain. That's a recipe for division and inaction.
I'm going to close by asking you guys one last question directed to both of you, because I think a lot of people here tonight are probably been spending the last 9 months wondering, what can they do? What can the average person do? How can you do something positive to, dig us out of this hole, if I may say? So, because there's another line in the book, what can the average citizen do to, quote, help us reclaim the dignity of public life and the honor of democratic, small d, politics. So what would you suggest, just nuts and bolts advice for some of the people here?
Everybody in this room should run for office. But go ahead, Norm.
I would say first, find candidates that you like, recruit candidates, including going to young people and getting them to start working for people in office. Get them engaged in the political arena. That is, if they don't, then that vacuum will be filled by the kinds of people we don't want. Support candidates who have the right values and who are doing the kinds of things that we're talking about. There are lawyers in this room, and the legal profession has stepped up to the plate in a way that we have not seen before, and that has to continue. Do pro bono work. Help some of these poor immigrants. Do a crash course in immigration law if you haven't done it before. But also get engaged in some of the things that we and many of our friends have in making sure, through the legal process and otherwise, that miscreants, kleptocrats, bad ones are held to account in the administration and elsewhere. For those of you who are involved in a religious community, make sure that religious community is engaged in this process. And whether it is sanctuary churches and synagogues, or getting out there and helping the dispossessed and people, or trying to find ways to open up a dialogue with Alabama or others in Pennsylvania, maybe those who are on the fringes of Philadelphia who are mini Alabamas, and create for yourself some sense of where that pain is coming from, and don't fall into the stereotypes that these are all racists and anti-Semites, while we have to hold to account those who are. Find other ways through civic institutions to stay involved. But right now, especially, political action, getting the right people to run for office, making sure that we have good people in office, working to make sure we have a campaign system that can work, making sure that voters can vote. Those are all things, and supporting groups that help to do that, and we have a list of them in the book and elsewhere. These are all things where we can do our part as individuals and as part of civic society.
I agree with you, Jay.
So everything he said, because that is all very important. I just want to emphasize a couple of things within that. One is the right to vote. It's under attack in large parts of our country, and we have to. I think we desperately need universal voter registration. We ought to make it easy for people to do their civic duty. Our unpopular idea, potentially among some people in the book, is we believe in Australia's system of compulsory attendance at the polls, which I am for. We call it that because you can draw a Mickey Mouse on your ballot, but you got to show up. And one of the reasons I'm for that is that changes the pressure on local governments, because their job is not to suppress votes, but to make sure people can do their civic duty. But I also think translating all these concerns you have into direct political action on the ground. And just to underscore something Norm said, people will not necessarily be persuaded by pundits. They will not necessarily be persuaded by political ads, but they might be persuaded by you. And that actual old-fashioned door-to-door organizing and campaigning among friends and neighbors, there are people who may have very different political views than you have, but you know that you're the person who coached their kid in baseball or soccer, or you're the person in the neighborhood they can count on. They're going to listen to you and have a dialogue with you in a way they're not going to have with some distant person whom they can easily write off as some terrible person. And so an angry tweet isn't enough. I think it's really got to be translated into old-fashioned political organizing. And that's why our book is hopeful, because we think that Trump has given our country a jolt, and I could do without the means through which we got that jolt, but we can use the jolt. And he has also reminded us that yes, politics can be difficult. Yes, occasionally it's dirty. No, there are no perfect candidates. But if you don't get involved, some really bad things can happen. And if you do get involved, there's at least the possibility that something good will happen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.